Welcome, Wargamers, to the treacherous, blood-stained corners of the mortal realms, because today we are finally jumping into Dawnbringers Book 5, Shadow of the Crone, and this is video 1 of its coverage. I know that I am still catching up on lore videos. I'm hard at work at this, and if you want to follow along the plot with the Dawnbringer Crusade series, please pause this video, go back into this playlist you can see down below, and there's a ton more videos to get you caught up on them. And we're going to talk about the various parts of this crusade, as well as the main plot of what's going on, and the various sidebars that kind of give us a little bit more of a glimpse into the meta-narrative of Age of Sigmar. All this content is highly bingeable because it is ads-free thanks to awesome folks like you. And if there's anything that you are looking for when it comes to hobby supplies, models, things like that, if you would consider using one of the affiliate links in my link tree down below, every time you do, you go directly to supporting me, my wife, our cats, the channel. It keeps things ads-free, and I'm so thankful for everyone who does. With all of that out of the way, let's talk more about the Dawnbringers Shadow of the Crone. Now, this book is a little bit different in that the other ones started with kind of like a meta-narrative kind of glimpse, a third-person omniscient view of what the various crusades have been through, maybe like things that are affecting both of them. In this one, it's a little bit different because it begins with a kind of a sidebar story, and one that we need to remember as we jump into the main narrative of this particular book. This little sidebar story is set in Hammerhall Aqshy, and we know from the previous Dawnbringer books that this city is under siege, specifically from Crone armies coming at them from multiple directions. In the very first Dawnbringers book, at some point, Vedra turns back with a small portion of the Crusade's army to go assist in the defense of Hammerhall Aqshy once they realize, oh man, the Crone armies were just waiting for these Crusades to leave so they could pounce on the weaker cities. Well, our little side quest of a story here focuses specifically on a Daughters of Cain temple within the city itself. With this as the backdrop, a strange figure approaches. Some of the Daughters of Cain and a hag queen confront this person for trespassing, of like, you don't step into the Daughters of Cain temple all willy-nilly. And this character, this mysterious cloaked figure, reveals herself to be Prathusa, and is something called a Crone Herald. You see, during this whole siege of Crone outside the city walls, there has been a shadow war going on in most of the major cities that have a Daughters of Cain temple. There is a rift forming within their faction, between those who see Morathi as a god exactly as she presents herself in their battle tome, and those, like our Crone Herald here, who see her as a charlatan. We don't get a ton of insight into that narrative, because the conversation ends pretty abruptly with a brutal fight that sees the Crone Herald slaughter a bunch of witch elves, and he basically uses their corpses in a scrying ritual, where then the scene fades to black. And I thought I would mention it because, well, I mean, the book's named after this character, right? The Shadow of the Crone. It's a Crone Herald. And I wanted to remember that this is said to be happening in the background of everything else we're going to talk about, at least with Aqshy related to the city itself. And this is a good spot to point out that this book is laid out a little bit differently than the others. Like I said before, instead of, a third-person omniscient narrative on both cities, we start with this little sidebar story, but then it goes a step further and kind of divides the book differently as well. Because realistically, there are 3 distinct stories happening in this book. There's obviously the 2 crusades that we've been following forever. The one, the Crusade of Fire in Aqshy, led by Pontifex Zenestra. And then there's the Hammerhall Gyra Crusade, led by Marshal Thorian. But the third story that comes in with this book is actually what's going on back at Hammerhall Aqshy. And quite frankly, I like this because I felt specifically like the Aqshy side of stuff really got bogged down. And it just kind of became a repetitive, we fight 2 battles and shuffle forward, get more zealous. But remembering all the terrible things that are going on back at home is important, and I'm really stoked to get into it. So the way I want to tackle this is basically doing dedicated videos for each front. This video is going to be all about what's going on in Hammerhall Aqshy, because I am crushing these videos back to back and I need a palate cleanser from the Wheel Lady. Then we'll talk about the Aqshy Crusade itself, and then the other 2 videos will concern the Gyran Crusade. At least in this book, we don't get much of a picture of what's going on in Hammerhall Gyra, which I was like, oh, I want to know. But whatever. Okay, so Hammerhall Aqshy has been through its own journey that we haven't really even followed all that much throughout these books. It started with a plague of malaise, and then zealotry took over for a bit to get the populace excited and moving again, and it kind of helped purge away some of that, Nurgle loss of enthusiasm, we'll say. Then at one point, explosions started to erupt as enemies were crawling out of the mines. There was some bits of Skaven here. There was Gloomspite Gits coming up. There was a whole thing where refugees were pouring in because Trog the Trogkith King, or whatever his name was running around Aqshy. All that stuff was still happening. And now, at the outset of all that, there's at least 2 Khorne armies besieging it that happen to have artillery. I don't know, skull cannons, I guess. So they've been through a lot, and so I go through that quick list of things that we've seen them experience throughout this campaign because this is the most heavily defended place outside of Azir, and it does not look good. Now what's fortunate, I suppose you could say, is that the overwhelming majority of Hammerhall Aqshy's problems are outside, or at least external. As long as they're a unified force, it doesn't really matter how many enemies come at them. The walls will stand and we will ride this out and so on. But the problem is, not all issues are external. And that's where our story picks up in Hammerhall Aqshy on the trail of the fabled heroes Callus and Tull. This is a witch hunter for the Order of Azir and his Free Guild bodyguard that make a fantastic duo. To be perfectly honest, I've made this suggestion before. If you want a slice of the old world in Age of Sigmar, I say forget Gotrek. Go read the Callus and Tull books because they feel like that classic fantasy mapped into the Age of Sigmar universe, and they're just fantastic stories unto themselves. That's my hot take of the video. But Callus, our witch hunter friend here, is looking around and investigating a strange rash of murders that are going on within the city. It doesn't seem like an infiltration. They're kind of looking for, maybe Khorne armies broke a hole somewhere, or maybe another subterranean enemy got in. So it's not infiltration, and it was too bloody for it to be something like a civil riot. I mean, people were mangled and shredded and torn apart. This is not just people being unhappy about what's going on either. Upon his investigation and seeing the assailants that were all locked up, Callus is starting to get the sense that something's not right. It's as if one night, a whole group of people just went absolutely insane. They became gibbering fanatics. They only speak in a few kind of barely recognizable words. They lose whole clumps of their hair. They become gaunt and feral. And I like the kind of initiative here where he's kind of going through the Rolodex of terrible things that exists in the mortal realms. He's like, well, it's not a zombie curse because they're not dead. They're not infectious in any way in particular. They're just kind of plain old crazy. Now, one of the things that Callus does learn from his investigation is that through, sources of watching them prior to them going insane, they were drinking something called King's Blood. And this was shared amongst some kind of party. What happened to these people loosely seems like it might have been connected to this. And not only that, but it's happening more and more across the city. To yada yada just a bit, Callus takes these reports, these incidents to the city council, but of course, there's not a lot of attention to be spared because, this is a mysterious thing that we can't put a finger on as opposed to the very real, very tangible armies literally outside of our gates. It makes sense that that's where everybody's focus is. So Callus goes to a Stormcast Eternal in Hammerhall named Lord Castellant Valius, who's responsible for the purity of the city. Together, they reason that the pattern and scraps of information they have point to one thing. Someone is going to try and poison the waters of Hammerhall Aqshy with this king's blood. They kind of decipher this from mad gibbering and the scraps of paper and notes that they have from the people trying to write out plans that are playing out in their head. It's a lot of little clues, but basically that's the idea. They think someone's going to try and poison the water. There's not a lot of troops to spare, but the city has one unit, the Undercrofters, which is the 3rd Battalion of the 56th Wilder Corps, who excel at infiltration and subterranean tactics. Guys, these are the coolest things ever. They gave the Wilder Corps Scouts Cities of Sigmar unit a name and a background, and they just sound really cool. But honestly, between this unit, Callus and Toll, and the Stormcast himself, the Lord Castellan, that's your defenders of the internal workings of Hammerhall. And so, the party goes down into the sewers, being led by Wildacor bloodhounds, and basically I think they were kind of shown some of the scraps of stuff that the ghouls had, and were like, find them! And so the dogs are leading them further and further into the catacombs of the city, and it takes them a long time to get anywhere meaningful. You have to remember, Hammerhall is a massive place with a very complex web of water lines that link it, pumps that feed into reservoirs that feed into other pumps, and so on. But after a while, the tunnels kind of take on an uncanny feeling. Shadows begin dancing at them. Basically, this part puts everyone, the veteran soldiers and everybody, on high alert, and they eventually make their way into a large underground cavern, like a super chamber. Inside of this is an underground lake that's lined with all kinds of Duarden mechanisms. Basically, it's an underground reservoir that's pumping water here to the rest of the city. Only what they see here is horrifying and makes more than a few of them vomit up, because along every stretch of the walls in this cavern are tapestries of flayed flesh. Human skin and gore are everywhere. Dead bodies and all their insides are bobbing and floating in this water, which is now being pumped up to the rest of the city. At this moment, a shriek goes out, and hundreds of Flesh-Eater Court ghouls descend on our party. The Wildacor essentially plays a defensive maneuver to let Callus and Toll get to the mechanisms of the Duarden machines and shut the whole thing down. And when Callus finds it, he starts pulling at levers to shut down the water pumps. While that's happening, he's actually attacked by a Ghoul King, which he promptly shoots in the face at point-blank range. The Ghoul King then reels back, and from this corrupted lake bursts a Terrorgeist that he hops onto the back of. Which, this has to be like a really cool scene. I wish there was artwork of it. It just sounds awesome. And it's here that the ebb and flow of the battle kind of turns. It's on the other side of this chamber that the reinforcements they have, Lord Castellan Valius, or was split off from the group, and he came around, so now the four enemies enveloped, and the two teams work in conjunction to bring down the Ghoul King and ultimately stop the corrupted water from being pumped up. Now, one thing to note in this story is that Toll, I believe it was, at one point falls from the console, like the control console for the pumps, and before he lands in this corrupted gore lake that surely would have driven him mad or did something nasty to him, a winged elf swoops in and saves him. And this is where we get a direct interplay with our pre-roll story. The Crone Herald has shown up and has an active interest in keeping the soul of Hammerhall pure. Whether or not she thinks Morathi is God, these are our allies and we need to help them. Now, like all of my videos, I'm going to pause here and step back and ask, why is this cool? Well, first of all, the Crone Herald is everywhere. I love the idea of a religious, schism within the zealotry-based factions like Daughters of Cain. And I will absolutely be doing a video covering the Crone Heralds once we get caught up, with the main story and everything. But that sidebar was, for sure, really interesting. It makes sense that they'd also be there hunting Flesh-Eater Courts too. It's an interesting kind of mirror because blood is such an important part of their rituals as it is with the Flesh-Eater Court's madness. And of course, the Crone Herald has a basic need to preserve their own temple, right? Of course, it's self-defense in that regard as well. My point is, the Crone Herald, although they didn't feature much in this story, didn't feel like such a wild MacGuffin as I feel like other literal swooping in and saving the day, heroes have been in Age of Sigmar. At least the books about her, so I feel like it's warranted. As for the story here, I loved it. To be honest with you, and the simple reason is that we see on a very practical level what all the lore we've read in the Flesh-Eater Court books points to. You can read about King's Blood and how it's distributed to cities in the Flesh-Eater Court Battle Tome, but this is a story of what it's like when a city drinks it, which is the other side of that equation we don't get from the Battle Tome. What does it look like to be infected with King's Blood? What does that kind of destabilization look like? Well, if you're not looking acutely for it, it can look like riots. It could look like chaos worshippers. It could look like just general madness. And this story helps us kind of get the seed of an idea that King's Blood really acts like a seed itself. It makes a few people go very crazy, and if there's an opportunity there, a ghoul king will be alerted nearby, and then their task comes into basically corrupting this entire society that's already been seeded with king's blood. Bring them into the fold. In this particular case, it seemed the ghoul king here was doing a ritual that acted as a loci for the king's blood. Essentially, I think if they added enough guts and stuff to this water and were able to bless it, it could become, just as corrupting and evil and powerful as drinking Ushurin's blood itself. I think that was kind of the idea, but that this was going to corrupt people on a massive scale. But there's a few things that we don't get here. For example, how far had this corruption already spread is never actually specified. But we do know the source of it is at least stopped. That being said, I think it's a great self-contained story with Callus and Tull. Like if Cubicle 7 made a one-off of their adventure for Soulbound, which would be awesome. If you were with that Wilder Corps here, that would just be the coolest one-off story ever. Even if they all do meet a bloody end. But the clues that they had mentioned as far as them piecing together what's going on in the city, working their way down into the sewer works, being led by dogs, having to fight off villains on the way. It just kind of seemed like a perfect role-playing story that was just put on display for us. And now it's well, I want to play that now. Or at least have Cubicle 7 make an equivalent story of what's going on in Hammerhall Aqshy. That'd be cool too. I'll take that. So friends, I want to ask you as we close the video, what do you think? This is all the stuff that we get for what's going on in Hammerhall Aqshy. In our next video, we're going to see what's up with the Crusade, and you can decide for yourself who has it worse. And I would love to know your thoughts in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching, listening, and I will catch you next time. Happy wargaming, friends!